In Ontario, we wear our cultural mosaic with pride. Hundreds of different cultures, faiths, nationalities, and ethnicities, all living happily under one harmonious provincial tent. Joining us now to share their thoughts on what really goes on in that tent, in the nation's capital via Skype, Diane Pacon, professor of sociology at the University of Ottawa. And with us here in studio, Radcliffe Dockery, president and CEO of Higher Eye Training and Consulting. Samuel Getachew, community journalist with the South Asian Generation Next. Balpreet Singh, legal counsel at the World Sikh Organization of Canada. And Jeremy Ablaza, Toronto-based lawyer and soon-to-be Canadian citizen. And we welcome the four of you here in our studio in Leaside. And Diane, nice to have you on the broadcast again from the nation's capital. This is the speech, the installation speech by the Lieutenant Governor, whose interview will be on after our discussion here. And here's what she had, some of what she had to say when she was sworn in as the 29th LG of Ontario. Roll tape.
All around us we see growing conflict among different religious, ethnic, and national communities, simply exploding into violence. Ontarians draw strength and encouragement from the fact that we have tried to construct a different kind of society, one that welcomes diversity, is interested in the traditions of others, and is based on fairness. But we cannot afford to become complacent. With changing demographics, increasing poverty, homelessness, and mental health issues, we need to reach across divides, get to know each other better. For surely our goal must be to live with dignity in just and sustainable communities.
Elizabeth Dowdeswell from her installation speech. Let's follow up on this. Radcliffe, what do you want to tell the LG about the state of multiculturalism in Ontario today?
It's filled with contradictions. It's filled with a lot of rhetoric, very little action. It's filled with a lot of catchphrases, but still not enough action. And I think it's time for us to start having real discussions and focus on the action behind the words, just not the paraphrases.
Samuel, how about you?
First of all, I'd like to congratulate the LG. I mean, it's rare that we have a premier and an LG who happen to be a woman at the same time. It's never happened before. And I would like to say, as an Ethiopian born in Africa, I think the Canadian system is a much better system than most countries. However, Bay Street still lacks the diversity we see on Main Street.
Diane Pacon, let's go to you in Ottawa. What would you add to that?
First of all, I would like to welcome the Lieutenant Governor and wish her the best. Concerning multiculturalism, I believe we have to, in a very honest and respectful way, revisit the idea behind this set of policies and this political cultural reality.
Balpreet, what would you add?
I think she's right. What we have is indeed the envy of the world, but we need to guard it very jealously. Whether it's the racist posters we saw being spread out at York University or Brampton, or what we saw in our neighboring province, Quebec, it shows that we have to very jealously guard our diversity.
Can't be smug about it, right?
Indeed.
We think we're pretty good. If you look around the world, we are pretty good, but you want to add more to that?
What we saw in Quebec with the Charter of Values, and previous to that, with the ban on the headgear and little kids playing soccer, we never would have expected that to happen in Canada, and some of the support we saw even outside of Quebec was disconcerting.
Jeremy.
I would say, speaking as a recent immigrant, I've actually been quite impressed about the state of multiculturalism in Ontario.
What impresses you?
You know, I find that Toronto is a very multicultural city. I don't spend much time outside of Toronto, but what I've seen thus far, even in rural Ontario, shows people have an appreciation for the fact that as a recent immigrant, I'm different. My experiences may have been different, and while they may not be able to speak with much knowledge on the issue, they're appreciative of my difference, I think.
Okay, you spent a lot of time in Toronto, but your girlfriend is from where?
She's from a rural Ontario, just sort of near London, a town called Embro.
How many people there?
At last count, perhaps 35. I haven't met them all.
Okay. How multicultural is her existence?
I think she would probably be, would find that I was right in saying that her upbringing was perhaps, well, was likely substantially less multicultural than mine.
Is that to suggest that it isn't working then?
I wouldn't say that not necessarily it isn't working. I mean, Canada is a big place, and I think it would be natural to assume that, or to see that cities would be more multicultural than the province, than the rural areas. You'd have people naturally coming in and where there are already established communities, and so where the support system for them is in place, which I think is only natural.
Deanne, let me follow up with you on this. I think it was Prime Minister Trudeau in the early 1970s who introduced the official policy of multiculturalism. Whatever that was back then, how different do you think that policy is as it actually exists on the ground today?
It's a different world, it's a different social context, and I believe that the idea is tremendous, and Canada has always been identified with multiculturalism, but the word is becoming a little bit obsolete, I believe. And today, what we have in Canada, we have a society which is made by a plurality of cultures. And the idea of the mosaic, like visually speaking, is that we see a mosaic, is that we have to be stepping back in order to see the entirety of the mosaic. Now what we have is that we have different diverse communities, but the relationship, the interculturalism, the transculturalism, actually, this is what I'm hoping for, is not existing. So we have diverse identities cohabiting with not too much interfacing. So I believe we have to congratulate ourselves of having had this wonderful idea that emerged from our society 30, 40 years ago, but it has to be revisited. It doesn't have to be abandoned. It has to fit better a society which is very individualistic, which is very tense. And one other thing, because I'm also an immigrant, but I arrived 40 years ago in Canada, the people who come here have a history. Many of the communities who coexist here in Canada, in their places of origins, were facing conflicts. So it's this idea of this romanticized idea of immigration, which people are coming here and they become amnesic, like they forget their past, has to be also revisited. So there is lots of work that has to be done.
Ratcliffe, you talked in your first answer about looks good on paper, but really needs some action behind it. What does that mean more specifically?
Well, I'm born and raised here. So I'm born right down the street from Queen's Park. I can't be more Ontarian than that. And I remember Frank Miller getting elected as leader of the PC party, watching it at about 9, 11 years old, saying, oh, this is what politics is. That's what got me interested in politics.
That was almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, so I'm 40 now, so I can say that. So the contradiction, I think, is that, growing up in Canada, going to the same schools that my colleagues went to, having the same friends, being involved in the same professional life that I've had, is that you've seen this diversity. Let's celebrate our diversity. It's nice. But as I've gotten older each year in my professional career, you don't see that diversity reflected where it needs to be reflected. So an example would be, my parents came here as immigrants 40 plus years ago. For them, multicultural is just, I'm able to come to Canada and start a new life. Different ball game. But now their kids are saying that we're here now, we went to the same schools, same experiences, same everything, and we're not seeing the opportunity equal the rhetoric.
So the bar's got to be raised now. Your expectations are higher than your parents.
So it's not good enough to say, great, I'm black, so I'll talk from a black experience. Great, we met our quota for employment equity, we have a black person working in this department. But once you start to show the leadership attributes to move up, there are many, many in the community who feel as if there is not a glass ceiling but a brick wall above them.
Whose responsibility is it to knock that brick wall down?
It's everyone's responsibility. And I think the problem is that you can't legislate that. You can put as much legislation you want. How do you change someone's attitude or what they believe in a core? I think that's really what it is. So it has to start from, I think, both sides listening. I think we'll talk about that later, but I think there's a lack of, when we say something that we're concerned about, be quiet. But everyone's allowed to say what they want to say, but I'm born and raised here. I have rights to speak up too. So I think we need to have where both sides start to listen more, and the nuances the professor was talking about. We need that nuance of being able to listen. I think that's what's missing
Samuel,
right now.
Let me pick up on another angle here, which was this notion that, yes, we have a very multicultural society, particularly in the Greater Toronto Area, but everybody lives in their silos. There's not that much mixing. Do you see that?
Yeah, I do, and it's slowly changing with the Stephen Harper policies and so on. I think the idea that you were discussing, which is Trudeau's idea of multiculturalism, which was perhaps, I should point out, was supported by David Lewis and Robert Stansfield. It wasn't just a liberal idea.
Those are the NDP and the PC leader of
in
the
a
day.
minority government. Yeah, and it's slowly changing. I think we're becoming more Canadian with the Stephen Harper policies. And I agree with my friend
Radcliffe,
sorry. I agree with him. Part of the challenge we're having is, the Bay Street crowd, the business, governments haven't become as diverse as we want them to be. But the reality is, it's also our faults. We need to be more organized. This is not some communist country. It's a capitalist system. And unless we organize and change our own status in this country, nobody is going to pay attention to us. And we have so many challenges, and we should never always look at government to solve it for us.
Well, Preet, I'm trying to remember now. Was it you who went to school and some kid came up to you and said, "I'm never going to be your friend," before even meeting you? That happened to you?
Indeed. My first memory of kindergarten is getting off the bus, and I actually had a haircut. My parents tried their best to make me look just like everyone else. And the first thing someone from my class ever said to me, he walked up to me and he goes, "I'm never going to be your friend." And he walked away.
What was the ethnicity of that kid?
He was white. So my daughter actually started kindergarten just this year, and it weighed on my mind that I wanted this to be a positive experience. So what I decided to do was, she wears a turban. We're all practicing Sikhs in our family. I went in and I brought in some turbans, and I showed the kids, this is what a turban is. Mine's very long, my daughter's is a little bit smaller, and I explained the significance. But I think this really reflects what everyone else has talked about, which is the evolution of multiculturalism. So multiculturalism on one level is understanding and tolerating diversity. Another is embracing it and celebrating it and becoming a part of it. I think the policies of the government have shifted in that direction. So rather than encouraging ethnic communities to celebrate in their silos, in their own spheres, it's about creating bridges, creating links to other communities. And I think that's the way to go. We have to create that space in our society where we can understand each other and ask those questions. For example, most of us are nervous about asking those hard questions. People never want to ask me, why do you wear a turban? What's the significance?
Why do you think they're afraid to ask?
Afraid of either seeming like they're racist or offending me. And that shouldn't be the case. We should create those safe spaces to have those conversations. And that's what multiculturalism has to be. One last example, Vaisakhi, it's the largest Sikh festival. It's celebrated by 150 to 200,000 people in Vancouver, about 100,000 here in Ontario. It started off as an exclusively Sikh parade, exclusively Sikh event. And what we've seen over the past 5 years is becoming a community event. People are being invited to come, have a meal, and just celebrate with all the others there. And that's what we need to see more of, celebrating together.
As long as you're so open to questions, I'm going to follow up with this. You keep saying Sikh, and I've always heard Sikh. Which is it?
The correct pronunciation is Sikh, but because that sounds a little bit like sick, like sick, people have sort of changed that into Sikh, but the correct pronunciation is Sikh.
Now the trouble is, if I say that going forward, people are going to call me to correct me. But you say so. I'll be right.
The Sikh community will stand with you here.
Okay, very good. Do you see this, Jeremy, in your daily life, where, of course there are lots of different ethnicities living, you mentioned you're living in the Greater Toronto area, but the knock is that it's really not multicultural because everybody sticks to their own community. Do you see it that way?
I was actually going to say, again, perhaps I've got a much rosier picture than everyone else, but I was talking about today's show with my girlfriend, and she mentioned that of the 5 or so couples that we hang out most with, for example, all of them are sort of an intercultural mixing. Off the top of my head, one close friend is Ivorian by way of France, who now lives here, and he's married to a Canadian from the prairies originally. Another of my good friends is a Jewish professor of philosophy, or ex-professor of philosophy, and is now married to a half Lebanese, half Korean lady. They have 2 beautiful children. I think perhaps I'm on the leading edge of that integration that we've talked about. or referred to. Professor Pakal has also referred to the need to integrate, and I think I'm on the leading edge of that. But perhaps I'm optimistic, but I see a little bit more of that than perhaps.
So basically, you're from the Philippines, but you don't only hang out with Filipinos.
I hang out with everyone.
You hang out with everyone. Okay. Deanne, let's go to you. I want to raise the issue because it came up in one of the earlier answers about the Quebec Charter of Values, and that was widely panned in all of the mainstream media across the province of Ontario. So many people thought that was outrageous. At least that's the view that we felt, that we heard, read, and saw in mainstream media. How about on Main Street in Ontario, in the various communities across the province? Do you think the view was similarly as outraged?
Definitely, definitely. Even in Quebec, I mean, there wasn't a consensus. Many people considered that idea as being completely racist and unacceptable in a democratic society. And obviously, we are not comfortable with this point of view that we have to regulate the lives of people and tell them how to dress and tell them how to behave and what to do and how to get married and so on and so forth. And this is the tension which I find very interesting in this debate on multiculturalism, is that, and this is one other thing that I wanted to take to the Lieutenant Governor, is that under the word multiculturalism, there is a reality which is way more complex, and we had the impression when we discovered this wonderful idea that, according to me, again became obsolete, is that we were going to solve all the problems like xenophobia, racism, harmony, everything would have, you know, been re-tailored with underneath this idea of multiculturalism, and this is what's happening right now. We realize, yes, we can be multicultural. Like one day we can go eat sushi, and then the next day we can eat souvlaki and falafel and so on and so forth, and go to this festival and that other festival, and then the next festival. But deeply, the important issues have not yet been bypassed. Of course, we are in a better society today than in the beginning of our history, but still the xenophobic element is still there. And someone mentioned earlier that, yes, I was discriminated against from somebody who was white. Now, white people come from different cultures also. Like I'm from a Greek background, and I was very much shocked when I learned quite recently that right after World War I, that's a long time ago, before multiculturalism, there were riots against the Greeks. You know, I don't know how many people were hurt. There was in Toronto actually. And it's a continuous, you know, dilemma, because it's not a matter only of race. It's like we all live and breathe in different cultures, and culture is something which is diffuse. It's not. It goes beyond the religion. It goes beyond aesthetics. It goes beyond everything. It's a sense of belonging. Like so, and you know, we have all that situation where the hyphenations now. Mm-hmm. People, they say I'm Jewish Canadian, I am Greek Canadian, Italian Canadian. So it's an unending process. There isn't a way of dealing with culture which is easy. And that's why I think that the time is ripe, because we got to this point right now where we are capable of discussing about it, like in today's program, without necessarily becoming completely hysterical.
Right. Well, in fact, Balpreet invited us to ask more questions about it. So another question for you would be, were you heartened at the reaction, the quite virulent reaction against the Quebec Charter of Values?
It was definitely reassuring. I mean, I look at the history of Canada. We're this year celebrating the 100 years of the Kamagatamaru incident, where a ship of 6 was turned away because of, frankly, racist immigration policies. Who would have thought 100 years later we would have a Minister of State for Multiculturalism who's a turban-wearing Sikh? Exactly. So I think, like I said, there's an evolution, and as opposed to focusing now on race, I think we're looking more at religion, and we're mixing up these concepts of multiculturalism and religion. But for me, it all boils down to the same thing, which is understanding. You mentioned that, what's the reaction on Main Street? I think it depends on what city you're talking about Main Street. What we saw was in areas with very little diversity, you had a lot more people saying, yes, we need to have a charter of values. We need to make sure that these people integrate. Whereas when you saw multicultural cities, neighborhoods, people were much more accepting. So it really boils down, in my mind, into a question of exposing ourselves and learning about each other, and that interaction, that knowledge, will pretty much erode intolerance as far as I'm concerned.
Radcliffe, how about you on that?
It's an interesting point because Sam made a point earlier. In an economic downturn, you see a lot of this ugliness pop up. And especially there's a lot of anti-immigration feeling, and people call me immigrant. So if I brought up an issue last year on social media, and people said, well, go back where you come from, or say, no, when I immigrated here in the 1940s, what I had to go through, and I'm like saying to them, well, I didn't immigrate here. And their discussion's over. They can't debate me after that. But this issue of economic integration is a bigger issue here. I look at there's the social aspect, which is important, but how does it play out? So in having these discussions over the years, what motivates people to change behavior is ultimately the question.
What's the answer?
And I don't know that everyone's a different answer, but for society itself, we depend heavily on the USA for most of our trade. That country is changing drastically. The Republicans may have a problem in 10 years if they don't figure out how to deal with the Hispanic and African American vote. They're gonna have a serious problem for presidency. We're changing in all our big cities. I live in the 905 where the term invisible minority makes no sense anymore. We call ourselves the invisible majority now, because we are the dominant cultures there. So in the world economy, where we're gonna go to expand these manufacturing jobs in Caledon that has mainly white workers who have been here since 1800s, where are they gonna export their goods to? If you don't have a cultural understanding of your cultural groups here, to go figure out how to deal with Southeast Asia, South Asia, China, how to deal with parts of European culture that's very diverse, and of course Africa, which Canada's lacking severely on trade policy as it relates to Africa. There's so much opportunity in Africa. We're a Francophone nation as well. There's easy synergies right there. We're not focused on that. So the word I always say is that I've been in 8 countries around the world talking about this. They always ask me, why don't you guys leverage the cultures you have at home to help us do business abroad? A lot of your people come here don't know what they're doing.
We hear that all the time.
They don't have a clue. So I think it comes down to, there has to be economic benefit to this as well, because it's not fair to tell people to say, come here to Canada, or you've been here, go get this master's degree, go get all this education, but when you're 42, 45 years old, you were a VP, you're no longer there, and that's it for you. So yes, there's gonna be an organization, we need to talk about it, but the discussion has to be about how do we motivate people to start thinking the right way. And let me add one last point to that. I've been in corporate sales for 15 years. I find when I'm dealing with senior executives of companies, they get it. I could walk in the door with my dreadlocks and it's not an issue. They're focused on, can you deliver value to help this business? I've had an example where a vice president, 58-year-old white male, had to turn to members of staff and say, you're not giving this young man enough respect and attention because his dreadlocks have a problem with you? When you go to Jamaica, you have no problem with his dreadlocks, but right now we need him to help us solve a business problem. If you're not interested, leave out the front door. Has to come from the top. I'm not saying in politics, but when I motivate people, if your boss says you better do something, that kind of motivates you.
Let me do a follow-up with you, because you're certainly the one person on the program today who I would expect to have a profound view on what happened in Ferguson with the shooting of that young man and obviously all the protests that took place thereafter. And the sense, I heard this a lot of times when that was happening in Ferguson. That wouldn't happen here. I heard that a lot. What's your thought about all of that?
Well, the Toronto Star released a report that came out clearly that while carding incidents are down significantly, carding of young black men has still grown at a rapid rate. The prison population is decreasing, but the prison population for black men and aboriginals is increasing at a large rate. Now, I'm not gonna jump in to say that must be racism. I need to look deeper into the facts. I spend some time in some of these institutions with young people of color, figure out how they got there. It does happen here. Blatantly getting shot. Well, I can remember in the 90s, Wade Lawson incident in Peel region, we all were afraid of the police. And even today, you could have my dad in the 60s will be driving his car and will tell me, every time an officer comes up behind him, he knows he's clean, but in the subconscious of many of us, we are worried when we see an officer behind us. I'm not saying everyone to understand where we're coming from, but at least listen to when we say that. So can it happen here? Yes. And I think even the police forces admitted they had to figure out how to deal with this racial carding issue.
Sam, when Ferguson happened, it did kickstart a massive debate in the United States about all of these issues. Have we had, or do we need to have, that kind of a discussion in Canada?
As he said, it happens all the time. Whether you live in Rosedale or Victoria Park, I mean, if you're a black guy, whether you're 35 or 55 or 75, you know when you see a police officer, it's time for you to run away.
It's time to run away.
Just run away. Or just pretend you're not looking their way and assume they won't stop you and ask you for ID.
What if it's a black cop?
It might be different because we rarely see a black police officer. I know there's a rumor that the next chief is going to be a black police chief, but still, I mean, we rarely see a black officer anywhere in the GTA.
Refer to hip hop culture. There's a song in the 90s by a rapper named KRS-One. He had a song called Black Cop on his album. And no, a lot of my friends are black police officers in Peel and Toronto who are fantastic. There are things that they don't want to say because they're worried about their job. So this is where the multiculturalism really comes to its head. No, to have the safe space to speak, is there a consequence if you speak? And while there might not be blatant like things you see in the US, there are many people I know who have had very blatant discussions about how they may feel from a race or culture standpoint, who mysteriously get let go from their jobs for some other reason. And it's hard to, so this is where it really hits the road. How can we have an honest discussion about it if in the back of your worried about a consequence, which could mean you can't pay a mortgage, you can't look after your family?
Jeremy, you lived in Canada,
Yes.
you lived in the Philippines,
Yes.
a couple other countries.
Yeah, Singapore, the U.S.
Who's doing multiculturalism better than us?
Actually, I would say Singapore is doing a very good job of it.
How so?
When you go to Singapore, you get the sense that there's a consensus about who is Singaporean. I think Professor Pacol mentioned that you have the hyphenation of culture here in Canada. You say you're Jewish Canadian, African Canadian, Filipino Canadian. When you go to Singapore, whether you are Jewish or Filipino or African in appearance, when someone asks you, you say, I'm Singaporean. It doesn't matter.
They don't hyphenate.
They don't hyphenate. And they have an idea of what constitutes Singaporean, and that idea encompasses a broad variety of looks, cultures, religions, ethnicities, what have you.
Do you think we need to embrace that idea a little more?
I think that would be sort of the logical endpoint of the full integration that we've been discussing here.
I think we've got just a little over 5 minutes to go, and I'd like you all to give some advice to the Lieutenant Governor, who may or may not be watching, whose staff I think probably are watching. What would you tell her? Diane Pacon, let's start with you first. As it relates to multiculturalism, what would you advise her to focus on during her 5 years in office?
Definitely on younger generations. They have found ways of creating those bridges that I was hoping for. I can see them as an educator, the intermarriages, the fact that they are in a daily life, not in a superficial bureaucratic way saying we're multiculturalists. They live it through their couple, through the way they are organizing their family and so on and so forth. So I believe two things. Again, we have to make the inventory of the pros and the cons of this concept, move to something which is more fluid, and definitely put the emphasis on the younger generations who their perspective on life, on race, on everything is quite different than ours.
Balpreet, what would you recommend?
I think it goes back to my initial message. What we have is great, but we need to guard it. And in order to guard it, we need to be proactive. There are a lot of sacred cows, I would say, that elephants in the room, as it were, that we're kind of nervous about addressing. So religious accommodation, reasonable accommodation, as it were, it's an issue that a lot of people talk about. For example, the Muslim student at York who didn't want to be in a classroom with female or didn't want to work with female students. That was a controversy that a lot of people had a lot of different opinions on. I think having the courage to address these issues in a forthright manner is important. And secondly, we don't like using the word racism, but it still exists in our society. And a lot of us are nervous about talking about it. Even in Peel, for example, we talked about the police. We had a South Asian police officer who talked about the fact that he'd been in the Peel police force for so many years and wasn't able to get any career advancement. And apparently, I've heard from other sources that this is a very widespread problem, not just in the Peel police force, but in many other places as well. So we need to address these problems in a forthright manner, proactively.
Let me just humor me for a second here. You know that there's been a controversy with the Ontario government because I think many in the Sikh community thought that there was you see, I said it correctly this time, in the Sikh community, thought there was an understanding that the Ontario government would allow an exemption for Sikhs who want to ride motorcycles not to have to wear helmets because of wearing the turban. And then the Liberal government announced recently that, in fact, that exemption is not going to happen, and you do have to wear a motorcycle helmet regardless. Did the government get that one right?
It's a question of perspective, really. So you have the British Columbia government, the Manitoba government that allow this. A lot of people say, well, that's completely crazy. Why would you want to ride a motorcycle without a helmet? And I personally wouldn't want to ride a motorcycle myself for safety issues. But the fact is, this summer was actually one of the deadliest summers for motorcycle fatalities. It in itself is a very dangerous activity. If someone wants to do something dangerous, there are a lot of things in our society that we do allow. For example, smoking. And we are willing to foot the bill for it. There was, in this case, it wasn't our organization that was heading the fight for this, but we were certainly supportive. There were certain accommodations that were forwarded, for example, no riding on 400 series highways. I think the Sikh community at large was expecting or hoping for a different outcome, but it's one of those things, there's different perspective, but it's definitely not a one-sided thing that, well, that's crazy. I think there's different ways of looking at it.
Because obviously people are looking for hints or clues as to how much religious accommodation one ought to accommodate. And do we accommodate in this situation?
Well, it really boils down to, when it comes to accommodation from a legal perspective, I look at a couple things. What's really being asked in the accommodation? Who's going to have to foot the bill for it, and who's really at risk? So if this is putting other people at risk, then that's definitely not acceptable. Here, the person accepting the risk is the rider. Is that a good enough reason to give them an exemption? British Columbia and Manitoba have thought so, Ontario apparently not, but I think it's definitely a debate. It's certainly not a slam dunk as many would see it.
Gotcha. Samuel, advice for the Lieutenant Governor,
please. My experience is different. People who look like me came to this country in the 1980s, the Indian Africans came in the 1970s and so on. Let me talk about the Ethiopian Association, for example. For the longest time, we used to receive millions of dollars from the government. Then Stephen Harper came, Jason Kenney came, they decided to reduce the amount they gave us. And all of a sudden, we now have an association, an office space that we bought from our own money to have and to serve the Ethiopian Canadian population in Toronto. So this policy of the 1970s and 80s, it might have worked then, but I don't think it's working anymore. And I think we need to speak to the young people. There are so many kinds of misgivings among the black communities, obviously, and I hope her honor will be able to speak to us, and we have a different perspective than the ones before. And we come from a different generation, obviously, and we're more ambitious. And that's why many young people are willing to listen to the Stephen Harpers of Ottawa than the Trudeau Liberals or the NDP of the Tommy Douglas and Jack Layton years. We're more ambitious, and I hope the LG will sit down with us, and she will not just speak to the elders, but she'll also speak to the young people.
Well, she's said that job one for her at the moment is to listen, not to speak. She wants to tour around.
I hope that's not just an empty promise. I hope it will be, we'll see it in practice.
Jeremy, how about you?
I'm no expert, but I would say to her honor, as what Pearl said, we're doing a good job. We need to guard it jealously. And I guess my advice would be more hazy, if you will, and just prepare for a long period of change. Requires discipline to see through a course, and incremental changes over time, I think, will make big returns.
Deanne, I'm literally down to my last minute here. If you can wrap it up in a minute, tell us what your advice would be.
Well, we have to be also aware that there are negative forces, you know, and many things which are not pleasant, like, for instance, the rise of a certain racism. For instance, look at in Europe, what's happening, intolerance towards the new immigrants and so on and so forth. So I believe we have to be optimistic, and we have to bank on all the successes that we had in the past, but also we have always to be aware of the dangers that anytime, you know, some racist movement can reappear. And I believe that through education and also through the arts are always a very wonderful way to communicate between cultures. And we're doing it, but we can do it in a more in a renewed way. I think this concept has done its time, and specifically eliminate all those things that are hiding behind this concept, and also the bureaucracy. There is way too much bureaucracy taking care supposedly of multiculturalism.
Deanne, forgive me, I'm going to jump in because I got to save time for the Lieutenant Governor. She's up next. Okay. Thank you, Deanne, for being there in the nation's capital. Thanks to you for coming to the studio here in Leaside.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.